Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Schaefer. I'm chairman of the Board of Trustees of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this program. Today, we're going to have a discussion about the upcoming elections in the United States and around the world. With over half of the world's population heading to the polls for major elections this year, leadership and foreign policy agendas can either be secured or significantly transformed. With the prolonged war in the Ukraine, spreading conflicts in the Middle East, crisis in cross-border migration, and other security anxieties around the world, including our relationships with China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Multiple polls report that Americans are more concerned about U.S. foreign relations leading into this election than in previous years. Before we get started, and I hand the program to our moderator, it is important to state that the NCAFP is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to facilitating discussion and fostering constructive debate around the policy issues that affect American interests. We solidly remain nonpartisan and do not endorse any political party, nor are any of the views expressed in this panel official positions of the NCAFP. Now, aside from public programs, the NCAFP hosts a variety of Track 1.5 and Track 2 diplomatic dialogues, special convenings, and private roundtables with thought leaders and regional experts that shape our world. We hope you'll join us for future events online and in person. This year, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary, and we encourage you to join our mailing list and visit our website to stay up to date on our anniversary events, including a gala award dinner, which we're planning for October. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our panel today. Dr. Heather Ashby is a principal consultant with the Corner Alliance, working at the intersection of national security and technology. In this role, she supports Corner Alliance's work with the Department of Homeland Security's Science and Technology Director. Dr. Ashby was previously the Associate Director for the United States Institute of Peace Program on Disruptive Technologies and Artificial Intelligence. She joined USIP after 7 years with Homeland Security, and she received her doctorate degree from the University of Southern California. Research interests include misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, as well as artificial intelligence and digital security and safety. Ms. Carla Ann Robbins is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she leads a roundtable series on national security in an age of disruption and is co-host of the World Next Week podcast. She's also Mark's faculty director of the Master of International Affairs program and clinical professor of national security studies at Baruch College's Mark School of Public and International Affairs. An award-winning journalist and foreign policy analyst, Ms. Robbins was deputy editorial page editor of the New York Times and chief diplomatic correspondent at the Wall Street Journal earlier in her career. She's reported from Latin America, Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. And Mr. Ali Wynn is the senior research and advocacy advisor for the U.S.-China at the International Crisis Group. He previously worked at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, the State Department, the RAND Corporation, and the Eurasia Group. He's also been a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center and a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute. He's also a security fellow at the Truman National Security Project and a former David Rockefeller Fellow with the Trilateral Commission. And he's the author of one book, America's Great Power Opportunity, Revitalizing U.S. Foreign Policy to Meet the Challenges of Strategic Competition, and co-author of Lee Kuan Yew, the Grand Master's Insights on China, the United States, and the World. Now, moderating our conversation is Nick Thompson. Nick is the CEO of the Atlantic and a trustee of the National Committee. He was formerly the editor-in-chief of Wired. He's also a frequent public speaker. He talks on and moderates events around the world. He's also an occasional musician with 3 albums of instrumental acoustic guitar music. And he's the author of The Hawk and the Dove, Paul Nitze, George Kennan, and the History of the Cold War. I also want to note that Nick is an avid marathoner who frequently writes about the physiology of the sport. Now, in terms of ground rules, if you should have a question during today's discussions for our participants, we ask that you please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and our moderator will read the question during the Q&A portion of the program. We will have 40 minutes of moderated conversation and 25 minutes for questions. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website and YouTube channel in the coming days. Now, I'll turn it over to Nick to lead off our discussion.
All right. Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you very much to the National Committee. I love those panels you host, the conversations you host. It's a great time. Let's get cracking. There's a lot going on in the world. So, Carla, I'm going to start with you. Let's talk a little bit about how American foreign policy is going to change in the next 8 months as we approach an election, and the Biden administration has to tack its policies on Ukraine, on Israel, around the rest of the world, for which will be I've heard, a highly contested election. So, Carla, what is going to be different in the next 8 months? What's going to change? And then we'll take it from there, cover the United States and cover the rest of the world.
Well, I'm a journalist. I'm not in the business of prediction. And I don't think that foreign policy is necessarily going to be driving the election. It rarely does. I think that if we're going to talk about international issues playing a central role in the election, or at least a adjacent central role, it probably will be immigration and trade. Most people tend to think of those as domestic issues, but they are very much international issues. And those are going to be issues that President Trump is going to be pushing. And we'll see how the Biden administration responds to them. Certainly the border crisis, I don't hate to use that word crisis, but there are a lot of people coming in, a lot of Americans very concerned about it. Lord knows why. We are a nation of immigrants, but this is, if you look at polling consistently, and Biden administration certainly is going to push on that, and they have a very good political position to do because the Republicans won't take yes for an answer on that. So we're going to hear a lot about that. We're in a very odd position on trade right now, in which we have two parties, neither of which likes trade. So we're going to probably have violent agreement on that one, although President Trump is getting, shall we say, former President Trump is getting out there more and more and more on the trade issue. He's threatening to put enormous tariffs on anyone who's in his line of sight. So we'll see whether President Biden, who is not a trader, he does not like trade, and he's very much lunch pail Joe on that. So we'll see whether or not he wants to take a more moderate position on that. I don't think that's going to be very popular in the swing states that he's appealing to, including Pennsylvania. But he's going to have to find in a lot of positions in which the more former President Trump gets out there, we'll see whether or not President Biden wants to look like he's saner, to be perfectly frank, on positions like this. And then President Biden has some pretty important decisions he's going to have to make, and that's the world pushing him rather than him pushing the world. And he's going to have to decide what position he's going to take on Israel. He can't endorse Schumer pushing Netanyahu and not make a decision himself. We're going to see what's going to happen. Will they restrain Rafah? Gaza's on the verge of a massive famine, already there in a massive famine. The world is going to shape him as much as he's going to shape the world. I don't think the American public is really pushing that hard, but the world is going to be pushing President Biden on this. And finally, Ukraine. If Ukraine is on the verge of collapse, I don't think he can sit back and watch that happen. So I think the world's going to be pushing President Biden. I think he's not going to be pushing foreign policy.
Do you think, let me ask this to Ali or to Heather, do you think that there will be issues where clearly foreign policy will not be the biggest issue in this presidential election? As Carla says, who knows when the last time it was, like 1948? Who knows? But regardless, do you think there will still be 1960? Okay, fair enough.
68.
Yeah, of course, 68.
Before you were born, I guess.
Yeah. Do you think there will be real differences on Ukraine, on Israel, where Trump and Biden take very different positions and hash it out in public? Ali, you're nodding. You go first.
I was going to say, Heather, if you wanted to go first, but I'm
too late.
Okay, I know. All right. Well, first of all, just before getting started, I'm really delighted to be here. I think that the work that the National Committee does is extraordinarily important, and happy 50th birthday. I do think that there will be clear differences between President Biden and former President Trump. If you look at President Biden's positioning on Ukraine, he views Russian aggression against Ukraine in quite existential terms. Former President Trump, the way that he talks about Ukraine, there are real questions about if he were to be reelected. There are real questions about whether he would continue U.S. support, military support for Ukraine. What about his disposition towards NATO? We all saw his comments recently that Russia should be allowed to do whatever it wants vis-a-vis NATO states. So there are clear differences between how President Biden and former President Trump think about not only Russian aggression vis-a-vis Ukraine and how the United States should support Ukraine, but I think it's broader questions about the transatlantic alliance, the architecture of European security. So I think there will be clear differences there. I think that there also are differences on the crisis that's emerging in the Middle East, at least based on comments that former President Trump has made. His approach essentially seems to be, or his position seems to essentially be, whatever Israel would like to do, the United States is not going to get in the way. I think that President Biden and his advisors are trying to strike a very difficult balancing act. And we saw the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, just in a press conference yesterday, trying to articulate the balance. So on the one hand, ensuring that Israel has the means necessary to defend itself, to prevent a repetition of October 7th, which was the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, and ensure the continued provision of humanitarian assistance into Gaza, and also to ensure that there's a credible plan that Israel has if and when it decides to go into Rafah. So I think that there are clear differences between the Biden administration and how former President Trump, how they're talking about Ukraine and Israel. I would just make one last point, and then we'll pass the floor to Heather. I think that there's also, there is a stark difference, I think, between just the worldviews. And I think the one important distinction between President Biden and former President Trump, and I think maybe the most important difference, is the consideration of alliances and partnerships. I think that this President Biden, deeply believes in alliances and partnerships as investments in American security, investments in American prosperity, and kind of America's unique competitive advantage. I think that former President Trump, he tends to regard competitors and adversaries sometimes with less suspicion than he does allies and partners. And so he seems to view America's diplomatic relationships as more of an obstacle or a burden than as a force multiplier.
Heather, do you want to weigh in on this question of where the most interesting differences between current President Biden and former President Trump are?
Yes, no problem. And so I first want to thank NCAFP for the opportunity to join this illustrious panel today. I think building off of the points that Ali made in particular, because he touched on a lot of key points, is I would segue into the idea of governance, and they have a very stark difference, former President Trump and current President Biden, about the international system, the role of the UN, international institutions, partnerships through multilateral mechanisms such as NATO. And so I think that's going to continue to come to the fore in thinking about these conflicts in various parts of the world. And I think that's going to be a stark difference between the two of them, is their view of whether the US should be a part of these international governing regimes, adhere to human rights law, join with other countries, such as looking at AI governance. And so I think this is a broader discussion that Americans should consider, not only the differences between each candidate, but also what type of country we should be in the future and what should our role be in the world. I think that's going to factor into the discussions and the considerations for voters, maybe not at the top, but it's going to be something that Americans will have to consider, because I think that's the undercurrent of what should America be in the world, and whether we should change it from the past or make adjustments or do a stark break.
Yeah, super
Hey,
interesting.
Nick, can I say something, which is I agree with both Ali and Heather transcendently. I think there's an enormous difference between these two men and the world. I mean, Trump wants to break NATO. I think that's terrifying, but I don't think that was the question you asked me. I think the question you asked me was how foreign policy was going to change, and I don't think that President Biden's going to try to put foreign policy at the center of this campaign. I think whether the world makes him do it, and how much he decides he wants to respond to President Trump's crazy, I think will be a very interesting question to himself, because the American public doesn't particularly want to talk about foreign policy right now.
Do you think Trump could break NATO?
I wish he would. I think he should put it in, because I think we are in an existential campaign right now, because I do think we're facing a threat to democracy, and certainly a threat to American leadership around the world.
Carla, do you think that if Trump is elected, do you think that he will try to break NATO? And do you think if he does, he will succeed?
Legally, it's very hard for the US to pull out of NATO, because the Congress has made that very hard for him to do. I think it's very easy to break NATO at this point, because NATO is based on an idea, the Article 5 commitment. And once you start questioning whether or not you're going to come to, it's a deterrent notion. And once you start questioning whether or not the United States is going to, I mean, the Balts are indefensible militarily. It's based on an idea. It's based on an emotional commitment. And I was amazed that Putin didn't test it during the 4 years of the first Trump administration. And I think that Putin exists to, his fondest hope is to break the transatlantic alliance. And I think that if President Trump is reelected, I think it's going to be very easy to do that. I'm terrified of it, to be perfectly frank.
So you think that the mechanism by which NATO would break would be Putin? I mean, if his bomb had landed, a quarter of a mile away, he would have assassinated the Greek prime minister, what was it, 2 weeks ago, which could have theoretically triggered an Article 5 response. You think that he might be more reckless at acts like that, see if Article 5 is not triggered, and if it's not triggered, or do you think he'll wait for Trump to just break it himself?
I don't know what Putin would do, but I would bet that President Trump wouldn't respond. And I think that would be the end of the transatlantic alliance. And that terrifies me.
Mm-hmm. Ali, I want to go back to something you were talking about, which is Biden's, the position that Biden is in on the Israel-Hamas conflict. And he's got the left wing of his party, which feels that he's far too sympathetic to Netanyahu and to Israel and to the IDF. He's got Trump on the other side. He's got Chuck Schumer calling for elections and the departure of Netanyahu. Explain the intricacies of his game theory over the next 8 months.
Thanks, Nick. So I mean, and I think, as you said, there are a number of intricacies, and it's a very difficult balancing act. And I think if I were President Biden, or if I were one of his top advisors, think about the number of constituencies he's trying to engage in. Think about the number of competing interests he's trying to achieve. Obviously, so interest number one, you want to get a ceasefire as soon as practically possible. You want to prevent a further metastasis of this conflict, which is already metastasizing in the Middle East. So he has those geopolitical considerations. He also, of course, and I think your question was getting to this, he also has his domestic political considerations. So we saw the results in Michigan, the number of individuals who voted uncommitted. He wants to reach those voters. And I think that the argument that he wants to make to folks who voted uncommitted is, we might not be able to meet 50-50. We might not be able to meet halfway, but you at least have an in with me. And we've seen not only the president, but his top advisors going out to Michigan, holding listening sessions across the US government, and I think trying very hard to demonstrate that, look, you have an open door, we're receptive to feedback. On the other hand, and this gets to your point about a balancing act and the intricacies, he also has to be careful not to veer too far in a direction in which people think that he might be abandoning the alliance between the United States and Israel. So and I think that this question, Nick, it gets to an important point, not only in the context of this conflict between Israel and Hamas, but it's a broader point about foreign policy. Your options in foreign policy are very rarely good, better, and best. They're usually bad, worse, even worse, and catastrophic. And so when someone says that a given policy is bad, the question is vis-a-vis what? And I think that sometimes for folks who are sitting on the outside, it's easy to criticize and say you should have done A, B, or C. But when you're dealing with these difficult juggling acts, I think the calculus is a lot harder.
So practically, that means that you expect Biden to kind of stay in the middle, be critical of Netanyahu, but not call for elections, pledge for the hostages to be released, but try to push, against a, ground incursion into, southern Gaza, sort of the line he's taking right now, try to provide humanitarian aid, but not so much that it really makes a difference?
Well, I think he wants humanitarian aid to make a difference. So I think the first two balancing acts you described, I absolutely agree with. I mean, he certainly wants to, I think, accelerate the infusion of humanitarian assistance into Gaza, but I think he is going to try to strike those balancing acts. It's a number of juggling acts, a number of constituencies he's trying to reach, but it's an unenviable position for him, both politically and geopolitically.
Not an easy one. Okay, Heather, let me go to you and ask about the actual election itself. What are the odds that a foreign adversary tries to manipulate the election, either by directly manipulating ballots or by trying to manipulate public opinion? What are the odds that they're successful, and who are the most likely culprits to go for this?
Yeah, I think the likelihood that there will be some type of interference through the information space is high. And I think the actors will be a lot of the common adversaries of the United States. Top on that list is Russia, which, as we know, has been active in the US information space for years, particularly during elections. And it's not only the US election, but Russia has been active in other elections across the world, such as in Europe and Latin America. And so I think that what's going to take place will be Russia, Iran, North Korea, potentially China, active in the information space. And that's not just looking at what's going on social media posts. It's creating fake websites that you could easily do with generative AI and create fake articles that help steer people in one direction or the other, or pollute the information space to confuse people. And I think you see some of that with what's going on with Princess of Wales, in which there's so much talk, and that's just the Princess of Wales. Can you imagine if it's around election time? In terms of our election systems, I would say that the US government is actively paying attention to this, and that's why departments such as the Department of Homeland Security, their Cyber and Infrastructure Directorate, has been at forward leaning, similar to how they were in previous years, of working with state and local governments to shore up their security, how they communicate with each other, the election systems, as well as to alert them to any type of foreign interference threats that are taking place. So I commend the administration for putting that at the forefront, even though that's not receiving enough attention, that day-to-day aspect of protecting our election systems from foreign actors or domestic actors, threats. But I think it's going to be challenging looking at the information space and where people could turn to for accurate information.
Very important question. So do you actually think that was the Princess of Wales at the farmer's market, or do you think it was a misinterpreted photograph? But no. But let me ask you this. Do you think they'll succeed? Like, what are, I mean, obviously you can't say 100%, 80%, but how vulnerable are we to this kind of manipulation? Have we figured it out? We got through 2016. We dealt with the Macedonian fake news, the Russian stuff. We kind of know what's going on. We know it's happening. We can identify the deep fakes. Or is technology coming so quickly and the bad actors are working so hard that we're really at high risk?
I think it's more the latter, that
Awesome.
technology is coming so quickly and it's hard for the government to respond, because the idea of disinformation and combating false information in the information space has become so politicized in the US that you have state governments suing the Department of State and their Global Engagement Center for their actions overseas, for concerns that it's going to have ramifications domestically, which is a bit challenging to conceive of. And then you have the Supreme Court cases reflecting some of the state laws that are trying to limit interactions between social media companies and the executive branch. And so, what I've been paying attention to in particular is how those Supreme Court cases play out, because they're going to have ramifications for the election. And since that decision will most likely come during the summer, it's going to be a short window of how the government could respond to some of these attacks without looking at threats coming from domestic governments to stop. How do we do media literacy? How do we engage with social media companies to say, hey, you need to take down content, or you need to be more mindful of how to prepare for the election, which has been a broader issue in the world, particularly for governments, of how these social media companies are preparing themselves after the wave of firings over the past year and a half, for trust and safety teams, for election teams, of how are they preparing to make sure that elections aren't undermined. And so I think it's a high risk, but what we can do is just in our everyday lives and how we interact with each other, having panel discussions that help get information out there. And I think another challenge, as we're looking at content moderation for social media companies, the new content moderation, which is generative AI, and what information is fed into them, and the adjustments that those companies make about what information is available, whether they time it to say, hey, we're not going to move past a certain date in providing you information. But what if the system hallucinates and makes up information? And so it's all of these challenges. But I think Americans, having learned previously to a degree, will have sources that they turn to, and hopefully they're accurate and real sources and not false websites.
Well, we can all be hopeful. Well, let me ask the three of you a question. Any of you can respond. Do any of you have a strong view on whether the United States government should force ByteDance to divest TikTok? And if they do not, to ban TikTok, something which would not happen before the election, but could have a huge impact on American public opinion and potentially American foreign policy. Anybody have a strong view on whether the correct vote for the Senate is yes or no?
Nick, you have a strong view on this. I want to hear what Nick has to say.
No, I'm the moderator. I will let Allie, do you have a strong view? If no one has a strong view, I'll give my view, but then we'll kick it on. All right, you can all contest my view. My view is TikTok does have huge power to potentially manipulate American public opinion. I think they have potentially shown it. I think it is a real privacy risk. I think it is a real security risk. I also think it is government overreach to ban a particular platform. So I am not in favor of the bill, but I am in favor of the outcome, which puts me in a difficult position of what I would do if I were a senator, because I would then have to decide whether I favor a flawed bill, which is kind of a bill of attainder, the way it was written in the House, right? It's directly written at ByteDance, even though they put a little clauses in to try to give them some constitutional protection. But there is a real risk. And I suppose the other vector you have to put it on, it is clearly a real risk. If you think that conflict with China is likely, whether you want it or not, or think it's a good idea, then I think you really have to push hard on this. But I'm curious whether, maybe I'll kick this to Heather and see whether you agree or disagree on this.
Yeah, I think from having worked in the national security field, I'm always mindful of efforts by foreign actors or domestic actors to manipulate American citizens. But I think that we shouldn't ban TikTok. I think we should build resiliency among the American people and having the ability to discern accurate information, false information, as well as making them more attuned to opportunities that actors will have to manipulate them on different social media platforms and other means. Because I just don't think it's social media in which manipulation could take place. As I referenced previously, it could be false websites using generative AI. And so I think so much of our views on social media and the information space are being pushed into TikTok instead of having a more broader conversation. And I support a lot of the efforts that Representative Sarah Jacobs has brought to the fore, that concerns about privacy or the Chinese government extracting Americans' data. That happens domestically with data brokers that sell Americans' data that may do it to foreign actors. And that's why the Biden administration released an executive order trying to limit data brokers providing information on Americans to foreign governments. And we'll see how that plays out, because it's challenging to try to legislate that area. But I think we need stronger privacy protections for Americans. And so instead of addressing those issues, we're saying ban TikTok. And I would just close on this particular comment. I was at a conference some weeks ago that featured panelists from a European country. And one of the questions posed to them was, do you favor a ban of TikTok? And the panelists responded that it would go against our values as a country. And I think in the discussions about whether we should ban TikTok is losing sight of what are American values and what should we hold true to, while at the same time making sure we're protecting Americans and the country from threats. And so I think with this election, we shouldn't lose sight of what are the core American values that we want to represent domestically and internationally.
Great.
Nick,
Well, let me
Nick,
go to
I
a
wonder if
question.
I might I just wanted to amplify a point that Heather made, which I think is extraordinarily important and I think too often underappreciated, about the imperative of cultivating greater societal resilience. And as Heather was making her remarks, this observation that Fiona Hill made a few years ago sort of came flashing in mind. So Fiona Hill said, she gave an interview a few years ago. She was commenting on the reality of Russian electoral interference. And she said, she made a very sobering observation. She said, Americans at this point are so riven by political animus towards one another. Americans themselves are so susceptible to internally generated misinformation and disinformation and so divided against one another that Fiona Hill said that she said Russia really doesn't have to do that much external meddling. Americans are going after themselves. And so just to I'm not saying that we shouldn't be vigilant against Russian origin disinformation or disinformation originating from other external actors, but even if hypothetically we were somehow to come up with some technological fix that could block the entry of all foreign origin disinformation, it's not clear to me that some of those broader societal fissures would dissipate. And so I think I just want to underscore Heather's point that as we have a conversation about pushing back against foreign origin disinformation, I think that conversation should be part of a broader conversation about what are the sources of political and societal dysfunction here at home, and how do we mitigate those issues and cultivate greater resilience here at home internally.
That is a very good point.
And you don't want to give the government, and that's the government overreach thing, which is you give the government the power to shut down any space where there's a conversation going on. TikTok now, the New York Times tomorrow. It is, to me, as a journalist, it scares me.
Yeah, I'm not in favor of shutting down the New York Times, even though they are a competitor to the Atlantic and are trying to poach some of our people, which I would prefer they didn't do.
I'm sure the Atlantic sees it that way. I'm not sure the Times sees it that way.
All right, let's talk about another issue. So Jeffrey Tao asked a very good question, which ties into our TikTok conversation. In what ways are the two candidates likely to differ in terms of China policy? Who wants to take that one? Ali.
I can take sort of a crack at this. I think, I mean, based on what former President Trump has said, I think, well, first of all, he's unpredictable. I think the most important, regardless of who his advisors would be in a second Trump term, Trump would be the ultimate decider. And what we've seen from what we saw when he was in office during his first term is he was quite unpredictable. And even in some of his recent statements, so look at actually on TikTok, his administration came out very strongly against TikTok. Now, Trump seems to be, recalibrating his position. When he was in office, sometimes he was eager to talk with Xi Jinping. Other times he denounced diplomacy with Xi Jinping. So I think the important point is that he would be unpredictable. Having said that, I do think that Donald Trump, if he were to be reelected, he has consistently talked, and I think Carla was making this point earlier, he has consistently talked about raising tariffs. So when he was in office, it was a 25% tariff on Chinese exports. He said that if he were to be reelected, that figure would go up to 60% or not more. And a 60% plus tariff on Chinese exports would basically take de-risking into something closer to actual decoupling. It would basically bring the U.S. share of Chinese exports closer to zero. So I think that we can say safely he would pursue something closer to decoupling. I think that with the second, Biden administration, I think that it would largely continue the policy that we've seen, which is you're investing in your unique sources of competitive advantage at home. You're doing greater work to build up your alliances and partnerships in Europe and Asia, and I think increasingly stitch together those alliances and partnerships in Europe and Asia. So I think that in a second, Biden, term, I think we would see maybe some tweaks, maybe some, maybe some polishes around the edges, but largely a continuation of the current policy, which again is centered on investing in you and our competitive advantages and centering alliances and partnerships. I think in a second Trump term, a continuation of sort of America First proclivities, more of an emphasis on tariffs, but otherwise a lot of unpredictability.
Does that sound right, Carla?
Former President Trump is so susceptible to flattery, and that he's quite dazzled by autocrats, and so he is unpredictable, but he is also at the same time he's threatening enormous tariffs on China, and at the same time we saw last time around he had a multi-front trade war. It's a very hard thing to run a multi-front trade war, so I can't predict what he's going to do. At the same time, I have found the Biden China policy quite confusing. I'm not a China expert, but I found this notion of somehow we can compete in some areas and we can collaborate on other areas. And I'm amazed that the Chinese haven't pushed back harder on our chips policy, that they haven't threatened us more with cutting off access to critical minerals or something of the sort. I don't know when a second term whether or not that could come to a confrontation. I understand their economy is quite weak right now, and everybody's lowered the tensions, but I don't know what a second term would be like. I mean, we're squeezing them pretty hard. And Heather and Ali and Nick, you all might know this better than I do. I don't know how much we're holding back their economic and military development with these two executive orders on access to advanced chips technology. But if it really is squeezing them that much, I mean, that could lead to potential confrontation, even in a Biden term. But I defer to you guys who know more about tech than I do.
I mean, I'll just on that one, it's certainly holding them back slightly, but it's also allowing Huawei the time to build up massive capability that they didn't have before. And probably in the long run, it is an incredible economic boon because it allows China to have self-sufficiency in chip manufacturing. But let me ask this question, because I think when I talk to folks in the national security, national security or in the military, they seem to be increasingly concerned about China making a move on Taiwan in the next 4 years. And so I'm curious from any of your three perspectives, whether the odds of conflict in Taiwan are higher under a second Biden term or a second Trump term, and how worried you are about this.
I can just go quickly, and then I'd be really curious, Carla and Heather, what you think. I'm not worried about kind of an imminent, Chinese attempt to invade Taiwan for a number of reasons. I think certainly for this year, I think that both, the United States for its reasons and China for its reasons, I think that they have an interest in taking this nascent thaw in the relationship and sustaining it. So if you're the Biden administration, you're dealing already with two crises in two different theaters. You can ill afford a new crisis in a new theater. And if you're China, I mean, to Carla's point about a weakening Chinese economy, you're trying to resuscitate your economy. You're trying to deal with growing coalescence among advanced industrial democracies pushing back against China. So you're trying to stabilize a relationship with the United States. Two, the fact that there's been so much turbulence in the top echelons of the People's Liberation Army suggests to me that Xi Jinping isn't confident. He isn't sufficiently confident that the PLA could actually carry out that kind of invasion. I would also say just two last points. One, I do think that Russia's difficulties in Ukraine I would hope, have had some chastening effect. If you think about how difficult it's been for Russia to conquer a territorially contiguous neighbor, now think about the difficulties of staging an amphibious landing. That's the most complicated military maneuver. And I think that the last point is, it's not clear to me that, from what I've seen, that Xi Jinping feels an imminent sense of urgency. I think that based on what I've read and conversations I've had, I think that Xi Jinping and his advisors still believe the time is on their side. If they can adopt a multifaceted pressure strategy, militarily, economically, and diplomatically, to slowly tighten the noose around Taiwan, so that in due course, Taiwan will say, look, we have to acquiesce to negotiating cross-strait tensions on Beijing's terms. But I haven't yet seen evidence that Xi Jinping feels it's an immediate imperative to go for the jugular.
Okay. Does anybody disagree? If not, we're going to move to some other parts of the world. Looks like we have consensus. All right, so I'm going to shift this one to Heather or Carla. Let's talk first about India. What do you think are the most important geopolitical issues at stake in the Indian election? Carla, I'll give it to you, and then maybe let's talk about Mexico.
Not a South Asia person. Enormous country and used to be described as a democracy, and it scares me that it's not.
Mm-hmm. And you are expecting its democratic status to continue to weaken as Modi pushes towards another term?
Yes, and I think he's leveraged his geopolitical position quite effectively, and that everybody's tippy-toeing around the way he fans religious intolerance, and he's quite the autocrat there, and everybody's tippy-toeing around it. And I also find the way that he plays, he's a member of the Quad, but at the same time, he seems to be quite neutral when it comes to questions like Ukraine. I understand that in the Cold War, we had all of he may be a you-know-what, but he's our you-know-what, but it's not the Cold War anymore. And everybody seems to be sort of tippy-toeing around Modi. I would prefer not to tippy-toe around Modi that much.
Well, tell me what that would mean practically. Like what would we change about the way we act towards India?
I think that we need to be a little bit more direct about what's going on domestically inside of India. I think that the increasing, repression in India and the increasing polarization that he's been feeding, I think needs to be called out more directly.
Yeah. Heather, Ali, do you have any extra insights on the Indian election, or do you have any issues that you think are particularly important as Mexico approaches another election?
I think one of the aspects that I've been interested in about the Indian election is their use of technology, Modi's political party, to flood the information space to convince voters to support his initiatives, his policies, as well as the party. And in addition to that, the way he has leveraged technology to make himself seem more relatable. There were efforts when we talk about videos, creation of videos through generative AI, that there were Modi generated videos that were sort of taking away some of the harsher aspects of thinking about what his policies are within India and making them seem more relatable and softer. I think for India, it's also trying to assert themselves more aggressively on the international stage. I know there's been some debate within various circles globally about whether to use the term global south or not to represent countries outside of Europe, United States, and the West more broadly. And so I think India sees itself as taking on some of that responsibility to assert themselves, bringing these other countries together. And so what you will see with a Modi election and policy moving forward is not only trying to combat and assert itself against China, in which we forget that India and China have conflict, have gone to war during the 20th century, and have violence skirmishes across their border, but also who is going to be more of a leader of these other countries where the West has had such challenges. And that has come to the fore when thinking about the war in Ukraine, of how do you get other countries on board to criticize Russia and to support Ukraine, send weapons to Ukraine, and operate within international institutions to call out Russia.
I would, Nick, I would just add one point on India, and underscoring points that Carla and Heather have just made. I've been very struck, and it seems like it might just sort of be kind of fixating on kind of semantics, but I think it's an important distinction. Whether you talk about Prime Minister Modi or the Indian Foreign Minister, they don't talk about non-alignment. They talk about multi-alignment, and I think that that difference between non and multi is very important. There are very few other countries that can say in the same breath, we're strengthening our relationship with the United States bilaterally and under the auspices of the Quad, but we also are non-committal on Russian aggression against Ukraine. We're deepening our relationship with Israel in security terms, but we also have a strong residual economic relationship with Iran. And I think that that sense of multi-alignment, the sense that we don't have to be sort of prisoners of US-China rivalry, but we can pit the United States and China against each other. We can exercise greater agency and bring together strange bedfellows to diversify our foreign policy toolkit. So I think that the way that India is conducting its foreign policy, I would venture, is increasingly going to be a template for how many other countries, whether they're middle powers or countries in the developing world, how they style themselves on the international stage.
And I do think that, I think there are several things here that Ukraine has laid bare that we need to grapple with as a country. And one is in the US-China relationship, is that, yeah, the Chinese didn't give the Russians as much as we feared. They weren't sending them tanks overtly, but as time has gone by, they have become more and more aid to the Russians, certainly the Russian economy itself. I think we really need to, that has to be a component of our relationship with Russia. We have to be aware of the fact that the Russians seem to be getting past the sanctions regime, and they're getting past the sanctions regime by dealing with countries that we deal with, whether it's China, whether it's Turkey, a member of NATO, whether it's India. Some of it is not just the question of oil, which we understand about stabilizing the global economy, but there's a lot of trade that's going on there that we have to think about. And that's one thing. And the other thing we have to think about is all of the fence sitters out there who one would think rationally would say, I'm really threatened by a big country invading a small country. Part of that is a debate about, whose rule-based world order. These are things maybe we got to deal with after Ukraine is over with. But some of it is directly, these are countries that are supposedly, Turkey, NATO member, China, what is our relation without calling the Chinese out more directly on this constant, they are giving, they're they're increasingly provisioning the Russians. And the Russians, one of the reasons why the Russians are increasingly doing so well in Ukraine is because of support from China.
Let's shift our focus now to another part of the world we haven't covered yet. Let's go to the Caribbean. We have a question from an anonymous attendee on our thoughts on the U.S. approach or lack of approach to a coherent policy in Haiti and the Caribbean. I believe that, Heather, you have strong views on this issue. What should the United States be doing about the current situation in Haiti, which is quite bleak?
Yeah, I think it's a very challenging situation. I think what is in the administration's head and other politicians regarding Haiti is the long history of US presence in Haiti, interaction with Haiti. And so I think some of the challenges with US policy towards Haiti is trying to make sure you don't repeat past mistakes and go down a path in which you may already know what's going to happen. If you put boots on the ground, we have an idea of what's more likely to happen. And given the other foreign policy challenges, how can you justify putting any Americans in Haiti right now with so much coverage of how gangs are taking over large chunks of the country and asserting control? And so I think efforts to put it within the international community is the right approach and look at how other countries could contribute and support Haiti during this time rather than it just being a US issue, even though I imagine as things continue to spiral in Haiti, it will become more of a domestic issue, and at least within the immigration realm. If we think back to photos of a border patrol agent on a horse and it was Haitian immigrants who are coming across the border that were part of that photo. And so I don't think that's lost on various communities in the United States. And so it's this balancing act, and it's challenging given how much effort the US is putting in with Israel and Gaza, as well as Ukraine, to then pivot and say, we need to figure out a Haiti policy when other politicians and experts have said that the US hasn't done more for Latin America and the Caribbean. And so now I doubt they're going to come up with a whole policy for Latin America and the Caribbean over the next couple months. This is something that's going to continue into a second Biden administration or issue that Trump administration will have to confront.
But okay, but let's take this thought experiment. Let's say that there weren't all these competing other, let's say that Haiti was the biggest problem in the world right now. And basically, Zelensky signs a peace agreement with Putin, hostages are released, everything's fine in Gaza. So we're now focused on Haiti. We're not going to put boots on the ground. What should we do? Anyone can answer that.
I think you go to the United Nations and you see whether you could do some type of peacekeeping effort in Haiti. The challenge is that you need potentially a Haitian government to agree to it.
Right.
Yeah, that's the other aspect of putting boots on the ground is you need a government. And if you don't have a functioning government, then what do you do in that situation? And so I think it is within the realm of the international community. I think also peace building organizations, to call out my previous line of effort, is that they are experienced in back channel and in speaking to actors the US government does not want to be seen as publicly talking to. So that could be included in talking to the gangs and whether they have uh, offices or personnel on the ground who could help intervene and come to some type of initial agreement on lessening the violence between the warring factions, which has happened in other parts of the world. And so I think those are two options to explore.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Moving to a different part of the world, we have a question from Timothy Richards pointing out that North Korea is selling arms and trading and helping the Russians, and wondering whether that will lead to a further crackdown on North Korea and American foreign policy in the months ahead. Ali or Carla, you want to take that?
I've spent a lot of time in my life writing about North Korea, and it's sort of hard to imagine starving a starving country much more than we're starving a starving country at this point. It's the Chinese are the ones that give succor and support to North Korea. And interestingly enough, I would think the Chinese would be threatened by this developing relationship between Russia and North Korea. It gives them less leverage over North Korea. And the Chinese have one interest in North Korea, making sure the government doesn't collapse, so lots of North Koreans don't go rushing across the border into China. So if anything, I'd be talking to the Chinese about putting the screws onto North Korea right now.
Ali, anything to add on that one?
No, I mean, I completely agree with Carl. I mean, I would just make the point. China has leverage, Russia has leverage, but I think that what North Korea has demonstrated in a quite, remarkable way, if you take a longer view, if you think about the buildup of its nuclear program, the buildup of its missile program, as much influence as even China has, North Korea has, I think, increasingly defied, China. I think that China right now would prefer if North Korea sort of reined in some of its more provocative behaviors, refrained from further tests, And I think that what North Korea doesn't want to abandon China, because as Carla said, North Korea's principal economic and diplomatic patron is China. But I think that North Korea has made it abundantly clear that it is willing to defy even its principal patron to remind the rest of the world. North Korea doesn't want to be ignored. North Korea's, I think, its biggest fear is being ignored. And if North Korea feels that it's being ignored, it's willing to make trouble even for its principal patron to remind the rest of the world, we're here, we matter, and we can cause a lot of instability, wreak a lot of havoc.
Well,
As you
someone
know,
should
of course,
send this
the
video to
state
tell North Korea
motto-
they have not been ignored.
The state motto for North Korea is nobody puts baby in the corner. I mean, that's really the.
Yeah. All right, couple more questions before we run out of time. We have one from our chairman, from Jeff. It's a question for you, Heather. And the question is, you mentioned that we should make ourselves more resilient to disinformation and misinformation campaigns. How do we do that?
Yeah, I think one aspect that's received a lot of attention, good and bad, and the state of New Jersey moved forward with this, is mandating K through 12 media literacy. And I think that's one aspect. I doubt that's going to happen on a national level because of concerns about overreach by the federal government. But I think more states could take up this effort. You also have, after the deep fakes images of Taylor Swift, more states paying attention to looking at deep fakes. And so they're taking up legislation across the country regarding deep fakes. I think that's another aspect of building resiliency, is attacking those types of sources. You also have conversations about privacy. And I think resiliency also has to do with making people aware of how vulnerable they are. And I think various privacy legislation taking place at the state level is a good place to start, as well as previous efforts at the federal level to address privacy and to have it reflect where we are right now in the country. And I think there are various organizations, nonprofit organizations, that are also engaging with communities to confront issues of polarization. And so, to go back to my previous job at the Institute of Peace, it seems so simple, but just engaging in community dialogues is so useful, as well as supporting local press, because so many challenges is how people are looking for other sources of information, and it may not reflect their own communities and what's taking place in their own communities. So supporting local press is so critical as media continues to be under strain and consolidation is taking place. If you have independent media sources, that could be so useful, and you could have people imagine themselves as journalists reflecting their community, and that could be where people receive information in addition to looking at national and international publications. And so there's various ways the federal government, state government, as well as nonprofits and media could be active in building resiliency for Americans. It's just a matter of having the will to do so. And once we see successes, to share those successes so others could pick up on it and try to replicate it in various states and at the local level.
Wonderful. Just a few minutes left. We have a question from Maria about, we haven't mentioned Africa. Are there elections coming in Africa, or other ways that Africa should, are there elections coming in Africa that you think are important this year? Or are there policy changes that the US should make to pay more attention to African concerns? Al, you want to take that?
Just a brief comment. I mean, I think that it's important to engage with, and I would say that it's not just the case with countries in Africa, but I think the countries writ large. I think it's important to engage with them on their own merits and engage with them on their own terms. I think that there is a concern that many countries express that they feel instrumentalized within strategic competition or great power competition, and no one likes to feel instrumentalized. I think that, so one, engaging with countries on their own merits and on their own terms, and I think two, recognizing that a lot of countries that we have to adopt, we have to view them through new prisms. If you look at Africa, I remember it was a sort of an infamous cover of The Economist at the turn of the century called Africa, a Hopeless Continent. They revisited that issue about a decade later and they said Africa, a hopeful continent. And if you look now where Africa is, I'm certainly not saying that it doesn't have its challenges, but if you look at its demographic outlook, its economic outlook, its technological outlook, I think that some of the most exciting progress is being made in Africa. So one, recognizing that promise, recognizing their agency, and recognizing their desire to conduct their foreign policy independently outside of the prism of strategic competition. Those would be some starting points.
That's a good one. I'm going to add a small shout out for the Ghanaian elections coming in December, only because, when Ghana made its transition to post Jerry Rawlings, that was one of the first elections and set of candidates I ever interviewed as a young journalist. So I've always been grateful for the success of the Ghanaian democracy. All right, 3 minutes left. Let's do a lightning round where we've had a lot of concerns, a lot of what Ali said. I think it was like worse, even more worse, and catastrophic, whatever. Give us a little note for optimism, something that you think could go well in the next 9 months, an election that you think could strengthen the geopolitical order, or something that will improve the world's foreign policy prospects. So anyone with a little dose of optimism so we can all go back to our jobs with a smile on our faces. I knew it would be a hard question. Carla.
I'm still in the afterglow of the Polish elections. Because, that was a country that, really had gone down into the complete mire of, authoritarianism, and it pulled itself out again. And now it's undoing all of those things. So there is hope. So I know that's
Excellent.
not looking forward, but it's recent.
It's recent and great. Heather.
I think for me is aspects of the European elections, because they've been doing so much in the governance space regarding technology, as well as less receiving less attention as media freedom and their commitment to media freedom by protecting journalists from being attacked and privacy issues. And so I'm optimistic that the Europeans will continue to elect officials who will be supportive of that and holding true to democratic values. So building on Carla, looking at Poland, looking at more broadly within the European Parliament, there are opportunities. And to a degree, I would say Mexico, because this will be the first time that a woman will be president of Mexico. And so despite the challenges in US-Mexico relations, as well as domestically within Mexico, I think that's also a shift that the US, whether President Biden or President Trump, will have to prepare for, as well as what that means for representation for Mexican society.
Yeah, and just for everybody who hasn't been following that one closely, there's 2 women squaring off against each other elections, I believe in June. Is that right? Ali, note for optimism?
I'll give you 3, and I was able to think of some just because I got to go last. I think one, the past few years have demonstrated a remarkable ingenuity on the part of doctors, scientists, and technologists. Look how quickly we developed a vaccine against COVID-19. So investments in pandemic preparedness, despite COVID-19 and Russian aggression, or I should say because of Russian aggression against Ukraine, I think a sustained shift towards renewable energy, and we see continued progress on the part of many countries towards investing more in renewable sources of energy. And then third, and certainly last but not least, the U.S.-China relationship, it's fraught, it's competitive, but I think it's in a more stable place than it was a year ago. And there does seem to be a commitment at the highest levels to ensuring a commitment to sustained diplomacy for, I think, the world's most consequential relationship.
Amazing. All right, that is a perfect note to end on. Thank you very much to Ali, to Heather, to Carla. Thank you to the National Committee. Thank you to Jeff. Everybody, have an amazing day.